Okay, what's up, everybody? Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are, whenever you're watching this. The Fifth Down Chat series is back. We've been away for a while, but we are back. And I have a great guest today. He wrote a fantastic book, one of my favorite college football books, one of my favorite American history books. And he's here to talk with us about his book and about the great game of college football that we all love, and a little bit of NFL too, which you'll see. So without any further introduction, I want to welcome Chris Serb to the show. Chris, thank you for being here this afternoon.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here, and thank you so much for your kind words.
Yeah, you bet. Absolutely. This is the book. I'll throw up some pictures here. War Football is Chris Serb's book, and I highly recommend it. We'll have links to it in the description. But before we get into that, Chris, let's chat about you a little bit because you're a very interesting guy. You're a Holy Cross Crusader, is that correct?
I am a Holy Cross Crusader, yes, class of 1992. Media maven Bill Simmons was lived down the hall from me my freshman year. We're old friends, and yeah, small but spirited college. We were 11-0 my senior year in Division I AA, as they called it back then. Couldn't go to the playoffs. The Patriot League didn't allow us to go to the playoffs. But
oh, is that right? I didn't realize the Patriot League didn't allow a playoff participant.
Yeah, they were kind of copied the Ivy in the early years. They probably around 2002 or so, which is 10 years after I graduated, is when they changed it and allowed their champion.
So potential national champion 1992 Holy Cross Crusaders denied the opportunity.
Yeah, I think we were ranked number 3 in the final poll. I know Idaho was great that year. That John Freeze, who played in the NFL,
oh yeah,
was in Idaho. But yeah, there were some good teams, but we definitely ranked among them. And I let me add that I was a fan. I was not a player personally.
Yeah, that's a bummer. It's funny you said they kind of copied the Ivy League. What's old is new again. We were talking about that a few minutes ago. Man, it all just keeps going around in a big circle, doesn't it? It's people have been copying the Ivy League since the beginning.
It sure does. Yeah, they found something really good, and Walter Camp's influence, and Percy Houghton, and some of the legends that maybe don't get talked about too much these days, but they really were the foundation for everything that we know and love today. And it's great that you're resurrecting a lot of those old stories.
Yeah, I hope people get into them like we do, because once you do get into them, that's great stories, and they're fun to follow, and they're enlightening as well. You come away from it with a little bit better perspective on the thing you love, if it's college football. So Holy Cross, then we moved on. Now I know you on Twitter as a pretty true purple Northwestern Wildcat. So after Holy Cross, you go to Northwestern. Did you get a master's in maybe an MBA, something like that? What did you do at Northwestern?
I got a master's in journalism at Northwestern shortly out of college. I think 2 years out of college, I went back and got my master's in journalism. And then as kind of a mid-career adult, maybe when I was about 35 years old, I went back to Northwestern and got an MBA.
Yeah, and that's that MBA has parlayed itself into what you do now, which I don't think anyone would guess if we said based on this educational background. Chris, you're the deputy district chief of the Chicago Fire Department. Is that correct?
Yes. I'm one of the deputy district chiefs. Yeah, there are 4 districts in Chicago, 3 shifts. So I'm one of 12 basically that run the fire operations and whatnot. For my area covers downtown, near north, a good swath of the south side. And for those of your listeners who know Chicago very well, from Lake Michigan, but then my border ends at about Ashland or Damon. It kind of cuts in and out. So it's a pretty significant prominent part of the city, I guess I should say.
Oh, absolutely. The heart of the city. If anyone pulls up a map of Chicago and looks up some of those cross streets and streets, you're going to see it's the heart of the city. It's right outside my window right here. I live downtown Chicago. So you are the chief of my area, Chicago, which is very interesting.
I hope you guys are getting good service from us down there then.
The best, Chris. Excellent. The best. We actually have a fire station. So I live right on Harrison and Wells. We actually have a fire station right out the window right here. And anytime something goes on, we hear the sirens fire up, the garage doors lift, and out come the trucks. So I'm actually if I went to my window and looked out, there's a little building in the way, but I could actually see the fire station out my window.
Okay, sure. Engine one, truck one, ambulance 41. Yeah, it's a great house. I've spent many a day there
Oh, well, there you go. Next time you're down, let me know. We'll grab a coffee or something.
for sure.
All right, let's get into your book here. It's called War Football and the Birth of the NFL. Let's start with the war football part. What is the war football we're talking about in this instance?
So war football was, and the New York Times originally coined the term, but it was what I would call varsity caliber football, but not played by colleges. It was sponsored by military camps, Army, Navy, Marine Corps training bases, originally in the United States, and then it spread over to Europe at the end of the war. But you would have these massive camps of 20, 30, 40,000 soldiers or sailors or Marines that basically you would have a couple of guys that might have been All-Americans in your camp. You had, 100 guys that played college football. You had even more that played high school football or knew the game. They would assemble an all-star team from Camp Grant of Rockford, Illinois, or Fort Harrison of Indianapolis, or Camp Gordon of Atlanta, Georgia. They would get a representative team together, and they would play other Army camps, Navy camps, training bases, et cetera, and they would play the top colleges in front of pretty huge crowds, and they would raise tremendous amounts of money for the war effort in the process. And they would sell war bonds, and they put on a good show, and folks really came out and supported it. And part of that was the patriotism aspect. Let's support the troops. But the huge part of that was let's watch some good football. Football was really starting to come into its own before the war, and people wondered if the war would kill football, at least temporarily. And it wound up being one of the best things that happened to the sport that we love.
Yeah, it did. I think you said there are 33 cantonments around the country with
Yes.
a certain, what was it, as many as 40,000 men at these bases? Some large number of men spread all over the country. But one of the things we're talking about here is why football. We're going to get into some of the details of that. But you can't have that number of young men stationed together at various places around the country and not give them something to do. It so happened that they needed to be whipped into shape to become part of a military fighting force. And then it also so happened we had this game of football. So let's just do it right now. Let's get into Walter Camp. Walter Camp, they call him the father of American football. What fortuitous spot was Walter Camp in at this point where he got the opportunity to influence United States military policy?
So Walter Camp, who, as you said, was the father of American football. He'd been a great player back in the 1870s. He was an ambassador for the sport. He was a rule maker who really kind of crafted football into the game. The game that he played was really glorified rugby. It was very, very close to rugby, and it wasn't a very appealing sport to watch. So he came up with the idea of the scrimmage. He came up with the idea of alternating possessions. He came up with the idea of, originally it was 3 downs and later it was 4 downs to make, originally it was 5 and then 10 yards to get a first down. So Walter Camp really kind of crafted American football. But by the time of World War I, and he was still very much in the throes of his career then, he got an assignment. It was one of those $1-a-year jobs, basically a volunteer civilian job, but as Navy athletic director for the entire U.S. Navy. And they tasked him with coming up with a physical fitness program for recruits. And bingo, why not football? So we're not talking about the All-Americans. We're not talking about the the guys that were college stars. This was basically every raw recruit that went to a Navy base. You're in Barracks 1, and I'm in the radio school, whatever. They would make us play each other, and they would teach us the fundamentals of the game. And it was a tool to physically harden the troops in one aspect. It was a tool to develop certain things like leadership and teamwork and things like that in another sense. And then in a third sense, in a very important sense, as you said, you needed to keep these folks busy. It kept them away from the nearby towns, which had the bars and maybe the ladies of the evening, some things like that. And this was a very serious thing. They were there was a commission on training camp activities that looked at this and how do we keep these young men occupied and keep them from causing trouble. And when Walter Camp suggested this in the Commission on Training Camp Activities, they pretty much greenlit what he said and gave him carte blanche to establish football as a training tool. And this was what we would call regimental football, but it fed directly into war football. After you had regimental football, that's how it emerged. Wait a second, we got this guy was an All-American. This guy played varsity football at Michigan. They went undefeated last year. How about we assemble these representative teams, challenge other camps, and oh, by the way, we can make some money for the war effort in the process. So they kind of went hand in hand.
Yeah, that leads right into the next point, which is that Walter Camp quickly saw a bigger, more important picture for football once he saw all this organization coming together with all the football and military age males being assembled into groups around the country. With his strong organizational skills and his love of the game of football, he quickly saw a bigger opportunity. Before we talk about that, though, we have to talk about the patriotism of the era. I don't know that a lot of people today, now maybe a world war would be different, something on the scale of World War I, but I don't know that if a war broke out at this point that we would see just graduated All-Americans or current All-Americans or college stars rush to join the armed forces. So this is a key point for this era when we're talking about these military cantonments and then these bases, if people are breaking up into their forces. What kind of football material do we have in these places? Because the colleges aren't going to play much once we decide to go to war. So what do we have at these bases?
You wound up with some tremendous, you would have maybe a couple of All-American or All-Conference type of players. You would have folks that played at here in the Midwest, you had these cantonments like Camp Grant and Rockford, the Great Lakes Naval Training Station, some real powerhouses that had a ton of players from the Big Ten footprint, or at the time, I guess it was, it was the Big Ten again, right? In 1917 was when Michigan rejoined.
Yeah. I think they were calling it the Western Conference at that point, but the Big Ten.
Yeah. And then players from Notre Dame. Right. You really just had this assortment of yesterday. And the other thing is you covered many different eras there too. Right. You would have players that had played the previous year and got drafted or volunteered right away, but you had players from 2 or 3 or 5 or even 10 years earlier. Bertie Gardner was a guy that I wrote about in war football. He had played at Carlisle Indian School. He crossed over. He overlapped with Jim Thorpe just for one season, but he had played in 1907 was his last year, and then at Camp Custer of Battle Creek, Michigan in 1917, a full 10 years out of college, he wound up being basically first team All-American. Walter Camp didn't name an All-American team that year, but he named an all-service team for the best of the military players that year. So you got this 34-year-old guy who's been through the battles, playing alongside 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds. So you had that kind of mixing too. It wasn't just the different colleges coming together. You had folks from different eras coming together that, if I graduated in 1912 and you graduated 1916, we never would have played each other. We never would have faced off against each other. But now, but we're similar ages, perhaps similar abilities. We get to test our mettle against each other now.
Yeah, which of course was a fascinating thing for the fans to watch as well. So not only did you had a certain amount of either former college excellent players up to All-American stars, but you also just had what amounted to essentially massive tryouts for your football teams. So you had some star players, but then you also had 500 guys to try out and choose from. Amongst those kind of numbers, particularly with a game like football that's just so physical and explosive, and if you got any kind of coordination, you can play it, you're just going to be able to put together some really physically powerful teams when you have the option to cut 455 guys and keep the top 45 for your squad.
Right, absolutely. I think it was Great Lakes was that's the team where 500 players showed up for tryouts, but other teams would have 200, 300. At Great Lakes in 1918, which we may talk about this at some point when they wound up playing in and winning the Rose Bowl, they had guys who were backups who wound up being Pro Football Hall of Famers. They had guys who didn't even make the team who wound up playing in the NFL. They played on their regimental teams, or played for the radio school, which was basically a varsity caliber team. Great Lakes had a main team, but they had a couple of varsity caliber teams that would go play other camps, play against some of the colleges, and these teams were really stacked. These bases, these camps were really stacked. Again, 40,000 people. It's basically the equivalent of a Big Ten school.
Yeah.
But then again, with the regimental aspect, some of these folks had some football experience. Some of these folks that had never played football before wound up learning the game and really excelling and doing very, very well. It was really just kind of a once in a lifetime phenomenon, a once in a century phenomenon.
Yeah, it was. I'm looking down here at some of the numbers from your book. Full service, about 4.6 million Americans served in World War I, 600,000 of them sailors. In the Navy, around 150,000 people played some form of football during the war. And in the Army, they say as many as 1 million young men played football during the war. So you think about that short period of time, the United States was in World War I from 1917 to 1918. They've essentially just trained a generation of young men to play football in order to be ready to serve in the military. So we'll jump ahead for just a second here. What Walter Camp saw this as well. What does that mean when World War I ends in 1918 and all these young men fled back into the States with all these football skills, either for themselves or to immediately start passing on as teachers, coaches, fathers, whatever else it might be as we head towards the 1920s?
I think for a lot of these players, I think for the majority of players, they realized that they hadn't gotten all of the football out of their systems yet. The kind of career path that you had back in the day was you would go out for football as a freshman, and in most colleges, not all, but most colleges, freshmen couldn't play varsity football, so you'd play on the freshman team. Then you'd play 3 years of varsity ball, and then you're just getting to be really good when you're 21 or 22 years old, and then you're done. You graduated. There is no large scale professional football. There was professional football, but it was only about 20% of the pro football players before the war were college graduates or had college football experience anyway, I should say. It was more a small town type of thing or medium-sized town type of thing, a factory type of thing. A lot of factories sponsored professional football. Certainly some of the stars from college and especially disgraced stars too, Jim Thorpe was the big name in professional football in the mid 19 teens, and he was he was banned from amateur athletics after it came out that he had taken a few bucks to play a little bit of semi-pro baseball. It really an injustice that later got corrected. His gold medals were restored to him, but Jim Thorpe's like, well, they've cast me out. I might as well make some money any way I can. So he was one of the big names in pro football, in what pro football there was before the war. But then after the war, it really, a lot of these folks that wouldn't have really considered pro football before the war realized they hadn't gotten the football out of their systems. They saw that pro football was more of an option, and they had these really strong networks, and networks that maybe had a lot more connections than their networks before the war would have had. I may have played at University of Illinois. I'm lining up next to a guy who played at Notre Dame and a guy who played at Michigan. And, this guy maybe played at Harvard, and I might have known them. I might have played against them. Some of them I wouldn't have played against at all, but we didn't really have a tight connection. But during the war, we were not only playing football together, playing and practicing together, we were sleeping in the same barracks. We were doing our military training together. We were literally going into battle together. It was definitely a different type of connection, and that networking effect really paid huge dividends when folks started building their football teams after the war. And then another huge factor, I would say, is that the fact that these military veterans were now signing up for professional football, that really cleaned up professional football's image. It used to be, you would see professional football as kind of roughnecks and drinkers and gamblers and Sabbath breakers and whatever, whether they deserved that or not. That was kind of the public image. But now they're college graduates, or they had at least attended college. they are military veterans, they are
Yeah.
volunteers, they're public servants. It really kind of gave pro football, which didn't have such a positive image before the war, it really sharpened it up in a very short amount of time. Probably more than any other type of similar factor could have.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating hypothesis on what happened. Let's keep going down the pro football line. We'll circle back and finish with college. One of these guys you're talking about, of course, is someone we've all heard of, know anything about football, which is George S. Halas, who played for Hall of Fame coach Bob Zupke at the University of Illinois. And George Halas wasn't much of a college football player. He's one of the guys you're talking about who got a second chance, maybe a little older, maybe a little stronger, maybe a little smarter, to play football again at the Great Lakes Naval Station. And so what happened with George Halas post Illinois as World War I breaks out?
So yeah, Halas actually left. He was a senior, but he was an older senior. He had taken a couple years off after high school to work to make some money to go to college. And as you said, he was people that write about George Halas, you'll see these articles come out that it's like, okay, that person really hasn't done their research. They say George Halas was an all Big Ten end at University of Illinois. And no, he wasn't. He was a starter his senior year. That was the only year he played varsity football, the only year that he lettered. He was on the freshman team as a freshman, then he was hurt as a sophomore, hurt as a junior, played as a senior, started all season, but really wasn't anything spectacular. He was a good teammate. He was a solid lineup filler, but he wasn't anything special. But then when he went to Great Lakes, which again was the base that had 500 sailors show up for tryouts, he really blossomed that season. He turned into a star. He started every game. He lined up across from Paul Robeson, who's a college football Hall of Famer, when Great Lakes played Rutgers, and really neutralized Robeson. Patty Driscoll was another college football Hall of Famer. He was the star of that game. I think he scored 6 touchdowns, but Halas really neutralized Paul Robeson, and Robeson couldn't get anything done, and Great Lakes won by 40 points. The Rose Bowl was really Halas's shining moment. He would later say, kind of tongue in cheek or self-effacing, that was the only game that he ever starred in. But he had a touchdown catch, and then when another military team, the Mare Island Marines from Vallejo, California, they were driving in the fourth quarter, trying to get on the board. They're down 17-0, but it looks like they're going to score. Halas snared an interception, returned it 80 yards, and then got caught from behind at the 10-yard line, which again he lamented. I should have scored that touchdown, but he really sealed the victory. So he was MVP of the Rose Bowl. He really if he didn't have that season at Great Lakes where he emerged as a star, George Halas wouldn't have played pro football. He wouldn't have become Papa Bear, this tremendous, a very good player in the 1920s, but probably far better known as an innovative, pioneering coach and as an owner of a team that was really a dynasty for decades. That really kind of gave Halas the springboard to his Hall of Fame career.
Yeah, this is one of the most interesting storylines in the book, in my opinion. And one thing I really wanted to converse with you about this, because I agree with the premise and the hypothesis, and I think you prove it out pretty well, that war football was not only huge for college football, it was the impetus for pro football to begin and grow in this country. But George Halas came from the Big Ten, and as we said before, he played for a coach named Robert Zupke, and there was no conference in the country that had a more fraught, more difficult, more contentious relationship with pro football than the Big Ten. And Robert Zupke, I would say, was at the center of that. So I'm gonna read a quote from Chris's book, and it's a very interesting quote because it doesn't sound like a lot of stuff Zupke said later when his great star Red Grange was going to turn pro after he finished playing in his senior season before graduating, which was the bigger controversy. So Zupke says, why is it that just when your players are beginning to know something about football after 3 years, I lose you and you stop playing? It makes no sense. Football is the only sport that ends a man's career just when it should be beginning. And that was at the team banquet at the end of the 1916 season. How do we reconcile that Robert Zupke, who's clearly saying these guys are well-trained football players. There needs to be something after college, with the guy who calls his star player Red Grange a disgrace, basically, and says he has no business parlaying his Illinois fame into dollars in professional football because that fame belongs to Illinois and Robert Zupke. That's for the alma mater. Pro football shouldn't be the end of a college player. I've been trying to figure out what's going on there. I believe he can have both positions, but what's your perspective on that?
So I would love to be inside a Bob Zupke's head or an Amos Alonzo Stagg's head or something like that. And Newt Rockne, by the way, another very prominent coach at the same time, did not feel the same way about pro football. He himself had actually played pro football. But
right.
I feel, I have no way of proving this, but I feel that coaches like that would have loved to have had control. They would have loved to have had let's say an amateur Illinois alumni team that's going to play the amateur Notre Dame alumni team or something like that. And we're going to raise some money for the alumni fund, the stadium building fund, something like that, something along those lines, that the professional coaches, but in a college setting, could kind of steer. There was a lot of hypocrisy, those that a Zupke, Stagg, Stagg made a fortune from athletics. Walter Camp, now Walter Camp had a regular business career too, but he made a fortune from writing about football. And, he wrote books, he had regular magazine columns, and
right.
They were these champions of amateurism. And at the same time, they themselves were profiting off of athletics. They were profiting off of sports. There definitely was quite a bit of hypocrisy there. And it's funny that you mentioned the Big Ten. George Trafton, Hall of Fame, a Pro Football Hall of Famer, who played for George Halas. He played at Camp Grant in Rockford, Illinois, too. So he really kind of got his start, kind of got launched through war football. Played one season at Notre Dame and then went pro. Trafton had to quit the Chicago Bears for a season to be the line coach at Northwestern. I forget what exactly year it was, but the Big Ten wouldn't allow him to play on Sundays and then coach these college kids during the week. So he actually took a step back during, I forget what exactly season it was, but I would have to, I didn't go intensely into Trafton's career.
Yeah.
But it just kind of sticks out. It's like rules for me, but not for thee, almost, from these college coaches who, besides getting paid handsomely for coaching, possibly writing a weekly column, things like that, they made a boatload of money on these speaker circuits, which their athletes would go on these speaker circuits with them and couldn't accept a dime. They could accept a free meal, but if they accepted a dime, they'd be in violation and considered a pro, and they'd get banned. No, sorry, you can't play your senior year. You took you took $100 to give a speech at the Kiwanis Club of go for whole Idaho or whatever,
Right.
So yeah, there was a tremendous amount of hypocrisy, certainly, and that, I guess, that's been true. That's been true since the beginning of college football in a lot of ways. There's definitely been it's a lovely sport, a wonderful sport, a sport that I love, but there's definitely been hypocrisy on display for its entire history, and it's still on display. If the NIL at least makes it, some of these things that the $100 dinner from the Kiwanis Club, it would now be allowed under NIL rules, I suppose. So that's a good thing for the athlete, I suppose.
Yeah, well, it definitely is. We've been moving the right direction, and we're getting a lot closer to an equitable share for everybody. But it's, at that time in particular, there was almost a anti-pro football hysteria for a few years in the Big Ten. What you're talking about, the Big Ten not allowing a player to come back and coach a team on Saturdays who played and took money on Sundays. Stagg brought that to the American Football Coaches Association. They would not allow anyone to join their association who'd associate with pro football. Referees who'd refereed a pro football game could not referee a Big Ten football game. And there was just rhetoric around pro football and amateurism that was aggressive, to say the least. And a lot of it did come from Amos Alonzo Stagg, a fascinating guy, another guy to, if you're interested in college football, get into Amos Alonzo Stagg's career. he had some of the most grandiose pronouncements about the beauty and purity of amateurism while breaking those rules at his own school, breaking those rules for himself, and really doing whatever he want as a head coach, almost like oblivious to the idea that he was breaking the rules he professed for everyone else, as you just said, for thee and not for me. Stagg was near the top of that pyramid in terms of not doing what he said.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. That the tremendous book, Stagg's University,
Yeah.
And I get it. You know, I can understand where an Amos Alonso Stagg or a Bob Zupke is coming from, and Newt Rockne, even though he was cool with his players going into pro football, he displayed a lot of the same tendencies too. You built something beautiful, or you took something beautiful, something that was already good, and made it a juggernaut, and you want to hold on to every little bit of that, it seems, for those folks.
Right.
But yeah, one of the things that I recall when I was, and it doesn't come into war football at all, but it really raised a red flag with me, was talk about stripping players of their college letters if they play
Yes.
pro football. How the heck can you do that? That's that just seems absurd. You know, are you gonna revoke their degrees now? You know, I mean, you can revoke an honorary degree certainly if someone that your university has honored has done something disgraceful, I suppose. But if I earned that sheepskin, I should get to keep it. You know, I paid my tuition. Right. You know, I earned all my credits. Yeah, just because you don't approve of the fact that I played pro football, how are you going to do that? You know, and I guess they didn't talk about revoking degrees, but they definitely talked about revoking varsity letters and associations with these football programs that these players really helped build, and that the continuation of that program is largely due to Red Grange. You know, does Illinois have its long sustained period of success if Red Grange wasn't around in the mid 1920s? Probably not. Probably they wouldn't have been attracting the same types of recruits, the same types of attention. They wouldn't have built Memorial Stadium in the first place. So
right. Yeah. Yeah, Red Grange is he's like a breath of fresh air on this issue. He was a very, everyone called him, he was described as, I guess, a more humble superstar has never been known. Red Grange was very down to earth, the Wheaton Iceman. He hauled ice in the summers down in his rural city in Illinois, if it even is a city or more of a township.
It's a city now. My wife's actually from Wheaton, so that's kind of.
Oh, is she really?
Yeah, she would have gone to Wheaton Central if she had gone public, but she went to a Catholic school, and then Wheaton Central is the old Wheaton High School. It doesn't exist anymore.
Okay. Yeah, Grange was so straightforward about what he did. It really, I think Grange changed the course a little bit in how things were talked about, at least for a while. I don't know how long it lasted, but he basically said what Zupke said at the 16 banquet, which is, this is my skill set.
Yeah.
I went to college, I got an education, but the thing I'm best at by far is playing football. I have an opportunity to use the skills I built at college to make money. I don't feel like it's dishonest of me at all to parlay those skills into a career for as long as my body holds out, and then I can do what I want afterwards. And he basically said these things, and in the face of what I called the hysteria from the colleges, the stuff revoking letters and cutting off relationships with former stars because they had the audacity to make some money off of football. Grange's straightforward attitude was really kind of amazing for the moment.
Absolutely. And one of the things that Grange talked about too was this very limited window that he had. Yeah. I might as well make money off of this body while this body is still performing and functioning, because and obviously he himself saw he had that devastating knee injury and missed the whole season and was never quite the player after the knee injury, although he was still a very good player. I better get mine while I can, and he was very honest about it. And Red Grange really, war football, and I argue this in the book, and I like to think that I show a preponderance of evidence there, but if war football did give birth to the NFL, but it doesn't survive without a Red Grange.
Yeah.
Red Grange wouldn't have had this. I don't think that Red Grange, even with that brilliant and shady manager that he had, that CC Pyle, think they would have been able to carve a league from whole cloth. I mean, they tried with the AFL and then it failed after he had played the 1 year with the Bears. But so Grange needed that league, so he was a direct beneficiary, even though he was a little too young for World War One. I think he was born in 1903. He was still in high school during those war years. Maybe he was in grammar school the first 1 of the years. I don't directly remember, but he directly benefited from the framework that Hallis and Patty Driscoll and George Trafton and Guy Chamberlain and Fritz Pollard and these other war football veterans that really helped establish the NFL, what they created that led directly to the conditions that could help a Red Grange. You know, that the war football era got the NFL launched and it got it up to a certain level, and then it was kind of stagnating, and Red Grange took it up to here. You know, and then there were other hiccups. It didn't really become America's game until the 1970s, and it didn't really have a tremendous national following until the 1950s. And then there were battles with the AAFC and with the second AFL in the 60s, and there were a lot of crises along the way, but the foundation that these World War One veterans gave it really gave it a chance at survival, and everything else that came afterwards was, with the exception of George Hallis, who was there for the birth and was there all the way up until the 1980s. It was kind of a passing of the baton from the World War One veterans to the next generation.
Yeah, it really was. I wonder by the time we got to the 70s and 80s, how many people realized that George Hallis was there from the World War One era. I don't think we said the exact timeline. World War One ends in the fall of 1918. APFA, American Professional Football Association, was its original name. Now the NFL, that was founded in 1920. So you're talking about a short window between the end of the war and when George Hallis has his final glory on the football field, and then really leads the group together to meet at the car dealership in Ohio, Canton, Ohio, to form this football league. The timeline, as far as your hypothesis goes, is right there.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, that 1 year in between, 1919, was a fascinating year because and Walter Eckersall, who was a very prominent journalist, wrote for the Chicago Tribune, but also was syndicated. He noticed this right away. He noticed that pro football in 1919, the fall of 1919, had a tremendous boom. You had more teams, you had really high quality teams, you had a lot more former college players on these teams. And Eckersall made the connection. And I brought up one of these quotes in the book. I'm not going to dig for it now, but he mentioned that a lot of these players that are playing in 1919 were those that played on the service teams during the war, 1917 and 1918. And it was no coincidence. So 1920, the formation of the APFA, which later became the NFL, was kind of the 1919 phenomenon with football was really, it was a boom, but it was a chaotic boom. The creation of the APFA and NFL was an attempt to lend some order to that chaos.
Yeah.
And it was an attempt that succeeded for sure. Efforts had been made before and they had failed. And because of the right combination of conditions right at this time, everything worked out. Everything kind of fell together. It was kind of a perfect storm in a positive way.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. That's that's the professional outcome of what happened. Let's wrap this up talking about our sort of two strange, glorious seasons of military college football and the blend. One thing I wanted to just bring up, it's in line with this. It's a little tangential, but most teams, most universities failed to field a team, and particularly failed to field a strong team, as most of the young men went into the military in some form. But one team down south, led by a very famous coach known as John Heisman, the one who the trophy is named after, had maybe the greatest team in Georgia Tech history in 1917. And he kept his boys around. They had the Golden Tornado of Georgia Tech. I know there were some hard feelings toward John Heisman and Georgia Tech for having that strong of a university team at a time when many people were in universities and young men were making serious sacrifices for World War I. Did you bump into any of that researching war football? Was there any, did you come across John Heisman and his Georgia Tech team at a time when really military football was what was occupying the country?
So Heisman's great team in 1917. I don't think there was as much controversy over a team like that in that year because 1917 was the first year of the war. The draft had been instituted and folks volunteered and said, I'm ready for service. And the US Army said, wait a second, we're not ready for you yet in a lot of cases. Those 33 cantonments that were built all over the United States, they didn't open, even though we declared war in, it was April of 1917. Yeah. I forget if it was the 2nd or the 6th. Maybe President Wilson asked for war on the 7th, but that's minutia. It was April 1917. The mechanisms to build an army, to build a true national army for the first time had to be put in place, and recruits didn't start arriving in large numbers until I think September of 1917 was when they started showing up. And even then, they weren't filling the camps. It took a while to fill the camps and cantonments. So I don't think there was much resentment in 1917. I think you did see a lot more resentment in 1918. It's like, wait a second, how are you so good? What does it matter? Oh, this guy's got a deferment because he's studying this or that or the other thing. Okay, but yeah, 1917, there wasn't much controversy. 1918, it was a little more, where's your patriotism? Why aren't you off in the service? Oh, they didn't call my draft number yet. Well, why didn't you volunteer? There was, right. there was a fair amount of that type of pressure, that type of feeling or attitude in 1918.
Yeah, I know shortly after the war, there was some kind of parade in Atlanta, and the University of Georgia essentially made a float that said the University of Georgia was in France last year and Georgia Tech wasn't. It was a snarky little float, but their whole thing was, I don't even know if Georgia Tech played football in 1918, or if they did, it was like a very low scale affair. And they were upset that Georgia Tech got to haul in all this glory while their football players joined the military and joined the war effort. So that was just a little aside. What's fascinating to me is how these seasons played out. We've moved around this stuff. We haven't set it out explicitly. A lot of the sort of organization, the game day atmosphere, the feel that we have today kind of happened during this World War I period. We got a national anthem sung at the Rose Bowl, which wouldn't start till later in baseball. We have some military flyovers. Is that correct? With our new planes flying over stadiums?
Yes, they and a lot of the spirit of war football. You had to build a culture from scratch. What are you going to do? Well, you would come up with cheers. You would, again, you had hundreds of soldiers in your camp who had played college football. You probably had hundreds that were also cheerleaders too. So you would have you would recruit all male cheerleaders, obviously, but you would get these cheers and yell sections and bands. John Philip Sousa was the band director at Great Lakes. They had one of the best bands in the country. So you had all these things that kind of, the cheerleaders, the bands, things like that did copy college football, but military demonstrations didn't at all. We're going to bring out the big guns. We're going to have a flyover. We're going to have, I don't know if anyone, I can't recall off the top of my head if anyone like landed on the field, but in a lot of cases, these crowds, you would have a flyover of planes from nearby Army Air Corps or naval base. There was no Air Force at the time; that didn't exist until the 40s. But a lot of folks sitting in the stands may have, this is, let's say this is the middle of Kansas. I've never, I'm a farmer in Kansas. I've never seen an airplane before. Well, you happen to have a military base 10 miles away now. So that's what you're going to see. You're going to start seeing that increasingly, but it was really quite a show. There was quite a bit of pomp and pageantry, and you would have, thousands of soldiers marching in formation. And in some cases they would march from their camp, which might've been, if you're playing in a big city, some big city baseball stadium, and your camp is 12 miles away, maybe the maybe the corps from that, the cadet corps from that training camp might have started out at dawn and ended up arriving right before kickoff, and huge
Right.
cheers, huge displays of patriotism. Um, it really, I wish we had better film footage from the era. There's certainly some footage exists, but it would really be neat to see that on a large scale. And then reading these newspaper accounts, you can almost feel as if you were there.
Yeah. So we basically, we get sort of, I guess, 2 seasons and then a tournament out of this war of football. So let's go quickly through it. That we get, and again, circling back to past as present again, we get a Rose Bowl, basically national championship game. So 1917, 1918, 1918, 1919, we're going to play, or we're going to finish the season in the Rose Bowl. So let's go with that first season. Kind of, how does this play out between the teams? Are they all playing each other military games? Are they playing some college teams? And then what happens as we get to the end of the year and they say, well, how do we finish this? Are we going to play the Rose Bowl this year? What happens there?
So the teams that ended up playing in the Rose Bowl were both military teams, but they had played kind of mixed schedules. They had played colleges and they had played against other military camps as well. Initially, there was some talk about the Rose Bowl. Oh, let's get the best college teams, because again, the cantonments were slow to get up to speed, and you did have some really good college teams. You had University of Pittsburgh was undefeated. You had Georgia Tech. You had some juggernauts out there. I think Ohio State was in the conversation, or maybe that was, I'm not sure, but there were discussions about what are we going to do, how are we going to do this, and the consensus that came up in the meeting rooms at the Tournament of Roses committee was, we can probably pull off this game if we make it a military game, or make it a military benefit game anyway. So originally there was some talk, maybe we'll do a military team versus a college team. They wound up going with 2 military teams that year. But they got a telegram from President Wilson saying, I don't see why not. And President Wilson was a big football fan himself. He had been a student manager at Princeton back in the day, and back when student manager really meant something. It was basically a part of the coaching staff back in the days when they didn't have a professional coach, when the captain was the de facto coach and the student manager was probably had a lot more responsibilities back then. But they were able to pull off the Rose Bowl, and the Tournament of Roses committee wanted to have a Rose Bowl because they wanted to make their money. They wanted to fill their hotel rooms and have some of the pageantry that they had, and they were going to do at least some limited scale version of the parade anyway. The parade kind of predates the Rose Bowl itself, but the football was a big draw, so they wound up having 2 military teams. Mare Island Marines from just outside of San Francisco, and Camp Lewis, which was just outside of Seattle, one of the new cantonments. And they played in the 1918 Rose Bowl for the 1917 season. Camp Lewis wound up winning that. Camp Lewis wound up losing that game. Camp Lewis scored first, which was interesting. Mare Island Marines were a juggernaut. It was the first deficit they had faced all season, but the Mare Island Marines came back and won that game fairly handily. And then within months, most of the folks that played in the Rose Bowl were off at war. And one of the starters for Camp Lewis died in action, was killed in battle. But the 1918-1919 season, the armistice was signed in the middle of the season, but the camps were still up to full speed. It wound up being Great Lakes from just north of Chicago here against, again, the Mare Island Marines, which were undefeated once again in the 1918 season, and they had to face kind of ran a gauntlet. Had to play a bunch of other undefeated teams in a hastily arranged playoff to determine the West Coast champion, and they Great Lakes, and that it was expected to be a good game. It wound up being a Great Lakes blowout. They won 17-0, but.
Mare Island wore out finally after 2 years of just kicking ass everywhere they went. That first Mare Island team, for those who follow me over at Twitter and have read some of my stuff, Fifth Down, they were coached by a guy named Hugo Bezdek, who's one of the more famous American sports figures, one of the more impactful American sports figures you probably never heard of. If anyone wants to run over to Fifth Down and check out my piece on Hugo Bezdek. He's a guy who's worth knowing about if you're looking into college football history. As Chris was saying, at this time, the Rose Bowl was our first bowl game. It really set the framework for big game football in the United States. The Rose Bowl's in the DNA of all of our football, really. But in 1917, 1918, the Rose Bowl was not necessarily on the most solid footing. And Chris talks about this in his book. We had the original 1902 Rose Bowl with Michigan that was such a tremendous blowout of Michigan over Stanford that they based it running clock or stopped the game in the third quarter. They basically threw in the towel. The game was off for 14 years after that. It had only been back for 2 years. We had the 1916 Rose Bowl, Washington State Brown, and then we had the 1917 Rose Bowl, Oregon Penn. Oregon coached by the aforementioned Hugo Bezdek, who then coached the Maryland Marines. This war football really was crucial for the Rose Bowl as well. The Rose Bowl kind of established itself as the national New Year's Day big game football contest.
Absolutely. And war football did a lot to keep the game going. Whether as I discussed pretty thoroughly in the book itself, it launched the NFL, but it really kept the sport itself going during those 2 years. A lot of folks wondered if this was going to be the death knell for football, or if there would be zero football played at all during those two years. That this is war. It's time to focus on fighting and producing and killing. There's no room for child's play, and war football did keep it kept college football alive. It kept the Rose Bowl alive. The year after World War I ended, Lou Little wrote about this during World War II, but he wrote about the great atmosphere of college football in 1919, how it was a boom year. You had, again, you had the mixing of eras in a way that you didn't typically have before, because if I played in 1916 and let's say I was a sophomore or a junior in 1916, and then I missed 2 years for the war, I was able to go right back. But now I'm a hardened 23-year-old, but I'm only a junior in terms of eligibility. So you had a lot of mixing of younger players with older players, and players who had, yes, I'm a junior in eligibility, but I had 2 years of war football. So I've really got 4 years of varsity experience behind me, or 3 years of varsity experience behind me. So there really was a tremendous boom in college football directly because of the return of these war football veterans. And then that 1919 season, it kind of set the stage for the 1920s, which was such a glorious decade. But that 1919 season was overwhelmingly defined by war football veterans who had come back to college football. And that Rose Bowl was one example. It was Harvard against Oregon, and Oregon was dominated by folks who had maybe played in that 1917 Rose Bowl on University of Oregon, then played for the Mare Island Marines in 1918, and then they're back in 1920 playing for Oregon again. Hollis Huntington was the guy. I think he played in 3 Rose Bowls in total. And everybody played 60 minutes back then, so 180 minutes of Rose Bowl time. That's something you will never see again.
That's a great piece of college football trivia, by the way. The only guy to ever play every minute of 3 Rose Bowls. That's a great piece of trivia.
Right, that really is something. But the shadow of war football kind of hung over college football for several years in a very good way. The players. I don't think the last war football player was done with college football until somewhere around 1923. But then you had the specter of coaches too. Some really top-notch coaches, some of them who were guys like Hugo Bezdek, who were coaches before the war, volunteered as coaches during the war, and then went back to their colleges or to different colleges or whatever. But then you had other guys who really had their coaching careers launched by war football. A guy from Great Lakes that we talked about Great Lakes, Charlie Bachman, had played at Notre Dame. He'd been an All-American player at Notre Dame. He never played pro football. He wound up being a College Football Hall of Fame coach, and he got his start in coaching by coaching the line at Great Lakes. That's really where he got his first taste of coaching. Jock Sutherland, who had played at Pitt, had been a tremendous player at Pitt, got his first taste of coaching at Camp Greenleaf down in Georgia during 1918. He coached the fighting dentists. Basically, it was the medical camp, specialist camp for medical personnel. But he coached them to a 9-0 record, and then went on to be a Hall of Fame coach. Tremendous coach, won multiple Rose Bowls, multiple national championships himself.
Yeah.
So really, the specter of war football hung over college football for quite some time. It really had a even though people forgot about it, its presence was definitely still felt long into the 1920s and well afterwards.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. And we'd see something similar again in World War II. The game was more established by the time World War II came around, but following World War II, we had a very similar phenomenon with the young men who'd gone over, coming back as men with eligibility left to play college football. The special secrets of the coaching profession had spread amongst a certain group of men who then went out around the country and spread it further. College football has a very fascinating history with war. There's a lot of comparisons that often get made with football and war. Some of them are dicey and kind of uncomfortable, but there are many actual connections between the American game of college football and war, from Civil War veterans or near veterans or young sons of Civil War veterans creating the game to give us a martial activity when we weren't at war as a way to sort of keep prepared, which was an original justification for the game, to the World War I era, post-era we're talking about, and then World War II again. Each of those three American wars in college football are deeply intertwined in actual tangible ways.
Absolutely, very much so. And I have a kind of a fun chapter. It's a brief chapter, but Dwight Eisenhower was involved in war football also. And he's what could be more tied in with war and America and football than a guy like Dwight Eisenhower, who becomes U.S. president, but he got his start as a West Point football player back in 1912, and that kind of launched him on his path. He got injured, never was able to, only played the one varsity season, but Ike became a football coach before he became a general. And Stephen Ambrose was Eisenhower's famous biographer, and he noted this in his biography, said that in his meetings, in his councils of war, he would use terminology from the football field. Hit him hard and let's make an end run. And, he would football adopts a lot of the language of war, but war in turn wound up adopting some of the language of football. It was kind of an interesting and fascinating circle, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. Let's close with kind of the end of war football. This is amazing. We got our first playoff in college football in 2014. That's kind of when we got it. We agreed, the colleges and the media agreed to put this thing on television, but we had not only a playoff, we had an international playoff long before that. So famously, our Veterans Day, 11/11, November 11th, that's 1918. That's when the so-called Western Front went quiet. World War I ended. Now, just like the beginning of the war, when we have hundreds of thousands of young men scattered across the United States at camps, we've now got a similar number of men scattered across camps in Europe. So that could be a problem for the military. It could be a problem for the Europeans in their towns.
Right.
So we got to do something with these war-trained veterans. So what's the big plan that they come up with?
So the big plan, the big solution, General Pershing. So the armistice was November 11th. It was at some point in December, General Pershing announced, we're going to have a series of athletic competitions. We're going to determine champions of the American Expeditionary Forces in every sort of sport. And interestingly, football season came first. The season ran January to March instead of the traditional fall football season. And it wound up being a huge deal, a really big deal. You had over 60 teams that entered this AEF tournament. You had some really top-notch football players. You had the generational effect again that we talked about. You had guys that had played at Harvard or Princeton or West Point back, well over a decade earlier, but wait a second, I'm only in my early 30s. I can still play a little bit of tackle. I can block. I might not be able to might not be able to run the 40 in 4-2 anymore, but I can still contribute something to this game. It wound up being a huge hit. Packed crowds all over. The games were played all over Europe. You had an army of occupation. The Third Army was in Germany, so you'd see these soccer stadiums was probably what they used, that were just full of American soldiers watching the games, and soldiers climbing nearby trees to get a better glimpse of what was going on the field. And you had games in Belgium, and you had games throughout France. The bulk of our troops were in France, but it ended up with a series of AEF finals, which culminated in an AEF championship game in Paris at the end of March in 1919. And this was the first large-scale single elimination football tournament that was ever held. It was really something to behold. And the 89th Division, which was out of Kansas, they had formed originally at Camp Funston in Fort Riley, Kansas, and then they fought through Europe together, and then they were in part of that army of occupation, the Third Army, stationed in Germany right after the armistice. They wound up coming away with the honors. Their quarterback, Potsy Clark, didn't play pro football, but he ended up being an NFL coach, and a very good one, and also a college coach at various points. But just a tremendous, some of the names of some of the Hall of Fame type of players, and then folks that wound up doing very well in other walks of life too. Hamilton Fish, who was a college football Hall of Famer, played for the 4th Division. He wound up winning a seat in Congress that following fall, and then was representing New York in the House of Representatives for over 20 years, and lived to be like 102 or something.
Yeah, he did. Yep.
Amount of longevity. Just some really, and a lot of folks who played in the NFL, but just a lot of really, really top-notch football talent that emerged. And it was really kind of the perfect way to end the war football era, was with that tournament, with what was basically the first Super Bowl or college football playoff. 50 years before the Super Bowl was born, and more than almost 100 years before the college football playoff was born. So
yeah,
they were onto something.
It's really amazing. There are great details. That's why you have to read Chris's book, and you got to get these details. There's so many little things. Just one, for example, you noted that a 4th Division game, I believe, was played on like an island in the Rhine River, and it was sort of beneath the castle of Kaiser Wilhelm's. That had to have been one of the great college football settings of all time, at least the most unique.
Can you imagine?
And then Chris talks about it's really cool to see, international. It's played kind of around Europe, and then they narrow it down to the quarterfinals, and we move to Paris, the quarters, the semis, the championship. European royalty is there. Blackjack Pershing, the sort of supreme commander of the American forces, the American Expeditionary Forces, is there watching the game. It's kind of like all the pomp and pageantry of college football in a military setting in Europe. It's kind of one of those events that I can't believe is lost to history. And it's one of the reasons why Chris's book is so great. It's when you're picturing it, particularly as a football or college football fan, it seems impossible that this could be lost to history, an event of this magnitude. But I guess it's kind of like the rest of World War I in a lot of ways, which people just somehow forgot about.
That's right. And that was one of the neat things about researching and writing this book. I started going through old microfilm and reading the old stories, and I was like, how has no one ever told this story?
Yeah.
How is this eluded? So it was, it's kind of sad that it was forgotten for so long, but it was an opportunity for a writer like me and a researcher like me to kind of resurrect it, bring it back, and shine a light on it that had not been seen. I'm just glad that I was able to discover it, and I'm glad that I was able to get it published and to tell the story. I could talk about this stuff all day. I really just love getting the story out there.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I don't want to talk out your book though for everybody, because they need to go out and get it. So we've given you a detailed overview of what's in there, but there are many more details to be had. If you are, there's so many: history, college football, American athletics, world history, a fun story, names from the past, whatever you want. This book has got it. So War Football, I'll have a link in the description. You can go get it all wherever it works best for Chris to get it from. I promise if you're watching this, you will love this book. So we'll wrap it there. Chris, I want to thank you for coming on today and offering so much of your time. It was a great conversation. Love the book, and really enjoyed the conversation today as well.
I enjoyed it a lot too, Mark. Thank you for having me. And as you obviously could see, I could talk about this for hours. So
yes, sir. Get the next best thing. If you can't get Chris on the Zoom chat, get his book, War Football, and it'll be just like talking to Chris for hours about War Football, and it'll be just as good as this. So, all right, everybody, thanks for checking it out. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time. And Chris, take care of yourself and be safe out there. Next time we'll talk about backdraft. I forgot to bring up backdraft. Damn it. We'll do it next time.
sounds good.
All right,
All right,
Chris.
thanks
Take
so
care.
much, Mark.